otaku seem to me to be kind of very pure expression of hunger for information, even if the information is essentially meaningless.
Beyblade is a wildly popular children's toy consisting of tops specially made for competitive play. While their invention was relatively recent, with 2 short-lived fads in the early and late 2000s, and a longer ongoing series as of 2015, their history is surprisingly ancient. The word Beyblade is derived from the Japanese word Beigoma. The Beigoma is a traditional Japanese top used as a toy or in ancient ceremonies. It lacks a stem like many tops in the West, and is made of cast iron with a spiral pattern tip and a carved face. The Beigoma are spun by wrapping a string in a particular way so that when it's thrown, it begins spinning. They come in multiple different sizes and shapes, but in general, there are 2 main types: Pecha Beigoma and Taka Beigoma. Taka Beigoma are taller and easier to wrap the string around to launch, while the Pecha Beigoma are smaller and able to get under their opponents to flip them over, but require more skill to launch. The stadiums typically consist of a canvas, placed over an open bucket, creating a bowl-shaped surface to battle on. Though in the Kansai region, a mat is used over a box instead, creating a rectangular battlefield. But what are the origins of these Beigoma? What does Beigoma even mean, and where does this name come from? I've seen it thrown around online that Beyblade is an evolution of the classic Battling Tops game created in 1968 by famed toy inventor Eddie Goldfarb. The game includes a stadium with 4 sides where tops can be launched in. The tops have patterns and shapes reminiscent of Beigoma, except they include a stem, and they even have characters reminiscent of Bit Beasts from Beyblade. However, the similarities to Beyblade are likely coincidental, as Beyblade is much more inspired by Beigoma, which existed far longer than just 1968. So, how far back does the history of the famous battling top toy go? Tops are one of the oldest and most recognizable toys in archaeology. They're also a very simple toy that developed independently worldwide. It's thought that they may have developed from ancient peoples simply spinning natural symmetrical objects such as acorns or sea anemones. This then inspired people to create their own tops carved out of wood, the oldest of which date back to around 2000 BCE in Egypt. That's over 4,000 years ago. Many variations would develop around the world based on the cultures that produced them and their uses for them. Some examples include, and I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation on this, the dreidel, gasing panga in Malaysia, the Indian bwarwa, and many more. While today, tops are primarily used as toys, in the past, they had a range of uses from gambling to prophecy to even functioning as dice to randomize results in games. However, among all these uses, the Beigoma differs from a lot of ancient tops because its primary purpose is fighting. Somewhere off the Japanese coast, a fight for survival was taking place. Down here, there are many types of sea snails. Some eat algae, some are carnivorous. All had hard shells to protect themselves from predators. The sea snail is slow and must constantly be wary of crabs, fish, birds, and even us humans. But in a small fishing village, some such snails lost this battle for survival and were caught. Their innards were eaten, and their shell is left behind. This shell is called a baigai. Many sources claim that Beigoma originated from China, but some of the Japanese sources I looked at argued that the origin of the Beigoma was right here. It's thought that kids took this spiral shell, were bored, and spun it, and then history was made. We have evidence between the 7th and 10th century of shell tops, referred to as Beigoma, excavated from the ruins of the Nara region of Japan. These Beigoma are clearly manufactured. At this stage, the tops were produced by stuffing shells with clay, sand, or even lead before sealing them off with wax to produce a heavy and sturdy top. This processing was likely done by adults selling them as toys, but it's likely that they originated much earlier. They may go as far back as the 6th century, but at that point it's nearly impossible to tell a Beigoma from a regular baigai shell. As time went on, the etymology would shift, with words such as tatakigoma and soshibai springing up, However, as the phenomenon spread to the Kanto region, where modern-day Tokyo is located, Bai became corrupted into Bei, creating the word we now know today, Beigoma. Our oldest written records of the Beigoma go back to the Heian period, and there were actually multiple competing tops at the time. Beigoma was just one of many types. Their type was the Nagegoma, or throwing top, but there were also other types such as Buchigoma, or beating tops, which had to be hit by a whip to keep them spinning, similarly to many European tops. However, an anecdote about the child emperor, Goichijo, records the moment where they started to become widespread. In 1016 CE, an anecdote recounts how the 9-year-old emperor, upon ascending the throne, requested his servants bring him a variety of toys from around his domain. They brought him a number of fantastical toys, but none of them pleased him. None of them, that is, until the famed calligrapher Yukinari Fujiwara presented him with a Beigoma. It's been recorded that upon this gifting, the emperor was seen playing down the halls with the Beigoma day and night. This is also where we see the first use of a word to describe the top, okigami, or big mirror, to describe its movement and shape. More written evidence for the Beigoma would come in the Taiheiki, a Japanese historical epic set in the Kamakura period of the 14th century. Here, it mentions kids being fascinated by the top, showing its widespread popularity at this point. This is also the first recorded use of goma to refer to a top, being a shortening of komazukuri, which they were called at the time. While the top largely remained the same, the names began to change in the Edo period. Togoma, Zogoma, Gongogoma were all used, and one record refers to a Kongoma, or Chinese goma, which is where some Japanese Beigoma enthusiasts hypothesized the idea that Beigoma originate from China likely came from. Now, I will say I don't know enough about the issue to say definitively which origin point is true, and there may be no way of knowing which is true, but I would like to throw out there that, knowing Japan's conservative history, I do think a claim that erases another country's part in their history deserves some skepticism. The first evidence of Beigoma being made of metal is in the 40th year of the Meiji period, circa 1900. At first, they were made of brass, and they retained many of the features of the Beigoma, being shell-shaped with a deeply carved hollow inside. Soon, people began to make them from iron. The shape became more octagonal, and they flattened out, leaving a face that could be carved. So far, many of these developments have required adults and materials and skills not available to children. However, it's also important to remember this is still a kid's game. And not only that, but Beigoma is a competitive game. Traditionally, if you lose a battle, you lose your Beigoma to the winner too. Which, when you think about it, doesn't really make sense. What use does a losing Beigoma have to you? Because of this, kids were constantly modifying their Beigoma to get the upper edge in battle. There was a lot of variation around this time, as kids would shave down their tops to produce shorter Beigoma, or give them jagged edges, corners, or a sharper point. The patterned face could even be flattened out by pouring wax or lead over it to distribute the weight more evenly and make the top heavier. These developments continued until about the middle of the Taisho era. During World War I and the subsequent World War II, metal was in short supply. For many areas of life, this meant the death of certain luxuries, and it pretty much meant the death of the Japanese toy industry. This was not the case for the Beigoma. Instead, they flourished, and an explosion in the variety of Beigoma developed as kids developed them from different materials. Beigoma began to be made from pottery to glass to crayons and even sulfur. These were fragile, so production was constant, and the toys likely broke with too much use, oddly reminiscent of the eventual Beyblade Burst series. Fortunately though, the post-war recovery period was quick, and the late 40s to late 50s saw the recovery of many casting factories. From this, a new style of Beigoma emerged, now known as Mukashi Bei by the Japanese Beigoma Association, meaning simply Old Beigoma. These are marked by the patterned faces that now include floral patterns, Chinese characters, and even English letters, showing the influence of American occupation on Japanese culture. Soon, children's heroes such as baseball players and even literal superheroes such as the Moonlight Mask began to show up on the Beigoma faces. Even this far back, people had the idea of personifying the Beigoma, somewhat like bit beasts, in order to represent something else fighting through the top. And it was this connection to baseball mainly, that really caused Beigoma to hit the mainstream, similarly to the trading card boom in America around the same time. Companies soon saw this success and were eager to replicate. They experimented heavily with their designs by trying to change the shapes, by adding stems, and even creating string launchers in order to make them easier to use so they could be sold to more and younger kids. However, they progressed mostly the same as they were through until the 70s. This is where the beginnings of Japan's huge commercialized toy boom took place, with the popularity of robot figures and toys. Beigoma started to follow this trend by changing their material to more closely align with the one used in these figures. They also increasingly became based on media properties, such as this Ultraman set from the 80s. However, the 80s also saw a lull in the popularity of Beigoma due to the rise of video games.
We don't know how to free Zelda, but we do know why kids love them and critics hate them. John Stossel reports, nuts for Nintendo, when 2020 continues.
The NES is seen by many in Japan as the killer of traditional games. With the rise of the video game market in the 80s, many kids were spending more time inside on consoles than they were outside with Beigoma. One article I read noted that you could once see cheap Beigoma in every candy store on the street, but nowadays, you can't see them anywhere. However, none of that is to say that regular toys were dying out. In fact, the 80s saw some of Japan's earliest fads, from Bakuten stickers, Kinnikuman erasers, and Gunpla. In fact, it was the 80s that saw Japan's first really huge commercial toy boom, Mini 4WD racing. While it was never really imported to the West, car toys were huge in Japan, and continue to be with multiple manga and anime series about them. It even basically created the concept of using manga and anime to advertise toys like this. And moving into the 90s, one company would see the success of model cars in the video game market to create something entirely new. B-daman is an obscure series in the West, but in Japan, it's on par with Beyblade in terms of success, and in many ways was its direct predecessor. Based on another traditional Japanese toy, marbles, known as b-dama, B-daman grew out of a line of marble shooters tied into the video game Bomberman to help drum up sales for both series. And this marketing tactic worked, reviving this traditional toy while creating a whole new category of toys in the process. Because after the Bomberman crossover, B-daman began to create unique marble shooters not based on any existing properties. And many of these early designs seemed clearly inspired by mecha and the robot toys that were huge in the decades prior. These were showcased in a long-running manga series and later in anime. So, seeing the success of their B-daman series, Takara decided they should use all this experience they gained to revive another traditional toy, the Beigoma. Now, Takara had experimented with tops before. In the 80s, they created a toy called Spinja, with ninja figures that stood on the tops, and a unique spinning mechanism that didn't include a string, but this didn't seem to be popular and it has little connection to Beyblade. They also were not the first company to experiment with tops at this time, as Bandai created a line of Beigoma with string launchers in China called Spin Fighters. Their designs were based on Power Rangers and had a wholly unique and pretty interesting shape. Apparently, it actually took off and continues to receive adaptations to this day, with the most modern of which including motorcycles and guns. But Takara thought they were on the money this time. They threw everything at the wall, creating multiple lines of tops, desperately trying to get one to stick. They created Battle Top in partnership with Puyo Puyo, a game similar to Tetris, and Sugegoma, which had mecha figures and Bombermen on the face of the top, both of which created a key innovation in the ripcord. Except instead of a launcher, they both ran the cord straight through the top. Both also received manga adaptations by the mangaka Kei Aoki in Bon Bon Comics. Apparently, Sugegoma was actually a popular manga series running for 2 years, but both toy lines themselves didn't last long and the series had to be cancelled. On Aoki-san's Twitter, he even mentions that he was in talks with Bandai about a third top series based on magnetic rails, but that fell through when the toy flopped before the first chapter could even come out. it really seemed like tops just weren't catching on. That is, until Takara gave it one more shot. And in July of 1999, they finally figured it out with I think part of why the previous toy lines failed where Beyblade succeeded is in their fundamental design and purpose. The previous toy lines tied into what was cool at the time, but Beyblade was different. Takara advertised them as Beigoma, but with technology. Despite being radically different, they still kept the fundamentals of the Beigoma at heart. Beyblade introduced multiple parts that could be switched out to produce whole new bays, which is just like how kids would modify their Beigoma. And the creation of the 4 types, attack, defense, balance, and stamina, is reminiscent of the different types of Beigoma. The only feature that really got lost is that the Beyblades were originally made of plastic rather than metal. There were likely various reasons that went into this, but because Takara had failed multiple times before this, they were likely trying to keep costs down on what would most likely be another failed launch. As well, this was in the middle of Japan's lost decade and the beginning of their eternal recession, so it was also likely done to keep costs low for the consumer as well. But Beyblade was more than just Beigoma with technology. It was also the culmination of everything the Japanese toy industry was learning at the time. In an interview with Hitomebo, Akio Kitamura, the man in charge of the development of the first generation of Beyblades, mentioned how customizability was huge at the time, with series like b-daman, Chorokyu, and Metabots incorporating it. Apparently Yu-Gi-Oh! Also had a huge influence on Beyblade, as he said they wanted to incorporate a collectability element into Beyblade, and the naming system for Beyblade products being listed as starters or boosters reflects this decision. The interview also gives a lot of insight into the more capitalistic nature of Beyblade. The type system, for example, originally developed as a way to keep kids buying more Beyblades. He explains that if they ever designed a perfect Beyblade, development would end. But if they used types, they could create an endless loop of power scaling, keeping kids coming back. The Bit Beasts too served to make kids feel more of a connection with their bays. Originally, the face was empty, but Kitamura remembered a time when he watched a boy playing with a Beigoma based on an athlete, and he shouted out the athlete's name, inspiring the creation of Bit Beasts. The first Beyblades had a simple 4-stage structure with a bit chip, where the Bit Beast was contained, an attack ring, a weight disc, and a blade base. While the series saw enough success to receive more developments with the spin gear system in 2000, which added a 5th stage to the structure, it wasn't until 2001, with the release of the anime, that it really took off. It was quickly exported to the West, and eager to keep the hype going, Takara created the MagnaCore system of magnetic parts in 2001 and the engine gear system in 2002. However, metal was inevitable, and in 2003, they made a gutsy decision. They introduced the heavy metal system. In many ways, the heavy metal system was both a brilliant move and a brilliant blunder. This system was incompatible with the previous Beyblades. It is likely this lack of backwards compatibility that led to the fad quickly dying out. Despite this, Takara tried to keep interest up, quickly releasing another system in 2004 called the Gimmick Specialty System. This included Beyblades with crazy gimmicks such as Phantom Fox MS, which can split apart during battle, but it was too late. The series was dead, and it would stay that way for 4 years. But there were rumblings of something new starting. Takara made a mistake, but they were on the right track. They were still just figuring things out, and now they had the heavy metal system, and they knew which way to move forward. So, in 2008, 2 years after their merger with Tomy, they announced their next big hit. Beyblade Metal Fight was something completely different from what came before. The bays were completely redesigned from the ground up, and once again not backwards compatible. Because of the metal, the stadiums were also completely redesigned, now including walls to prevent them from popping out and hitting kids. Despite all this work, it was still largely just getting its footing. The first Metal Fight Beyblades had a single-piece attack ring that was made entirely of metal, and this can be seen in the manga with a very different looking Pegasus from what we would see later. It wasn't until the development of the hybrid wheel system in 2009 that introduced the energy ring, and the production of the anime, that things really took off. Hasbro undertook the task of importing them to the West under the title of Metal Fusion, and from there, things exploded. It's here where I'd like to take a look at the Metal Fight anime and some of the specific tops developed during its tenure. While Metal Fight seems on the surface unconnected to what came before it, there are a lot of elements that feel like direct nods to its history. For example, under the first line of Metal Fight Beyblades, all the bays are right spinning except for one, El Drago. And the choice of animal for this bay could be seen as a callback to the main Beyblade from the original series, Dragoon, which, before the introduction of the heavy metal system, was the only Beyblade capable of left rotation. The anime also introduces its own lore that seems to reflect the real-life lore of the Beigoma. In the Metal Fusion anime, the Beyblades are known to have existed since ancient times as a traditional sport, like the Beigoma, and they were even made from meteorites, much like how real-life Beigoma are cast from metal. Maybe it was those nods to history, or maybe it was just a really cool toy line, but Metal Fight was huge back in the early 2010s. It was so popular that Western company Nelvana commissioned a spin-off series in 2011, culminating in the horrible existence of Bay Wheels and Bay Raiders, as well as their subsequent sequels. 2011 also coincides with the introduction of the 4D system, with more complex parts, as well as the height of the mini knockoff Beyblades. Many brands tried to capitalize off the success of Beyblade, such as Battle Strikers, which used magnetic fingertips to control their tops, and even established companies like LEGO tried to take a slice of the pie. While from what I can gather, the development history of LEGO Ninjago suggests it wasn't really related to Metal Fight, certainly it was at the right place at the right time, and the company knew what they were doing in advertising a spinning toy in 2011. Actually, Metal Fight was so popular that many collectors still exist to this day, and the omnipresent counterfeits started to become a huge problem as companies started replicating existing bays entirely, creating what are now known in the collecting community as midfakes. Because of these, it is nearly impossible to find certain genuine Metal Fight Beyblades, and it's become a huge problem for the meta. Yes, there is a Beyblade meta. However, while the series was immensely popular, that popularity was once again short-lived, as Takara Tomy made a repeat of their mistake with the original series. While trying to shake up the series and keep it fresh, they performed a soft reboot introducing the Zero-G system and creating the series known in the West as Shogun Steel. This introduced two-piece metal wheels that were not compatible with previous tops. This line unfortunately didn't last long, and the Shogun Steel anime didn't even finish airing in America or Japan, and by 2013, Beyblade was once again dead. However, it would not be gone for long this time, as only 2 years later, in 2015, we saw the introduction of Beyblade Burst. And what's fascinating about Burst is that, much like the first series, it bases its gimmick off of how kids actually used the tops. If you weren't there at the time, during Metal Fusion, it was easy to create a condition where, while battling, you could cause another Beyblade to explode if you left the face bolt holding it together slightly loosened. Takara Tomy must have seen this and created the new Burst system, which created the new win condition of the Burst finish. While Beyblade spinning out or being knocked out of the stadium was worth a single match point, a Burst finish was now worth 2. Burst's early history was similar to Metal Fusion's and the original series, having a simple layer system upon release, before adding an extra layer and the dual layer system the following year. However, unlike Metal Fight, these two layers were inseparable. 2017 would then see the introduction of a core disc layer and gimmicks to the layers. Up until this point, Hasbro has manufactured the same Beyblades produced by Takara Tomy with only slight alterations. Usually they used cheaper materials, but they didn't do anything that drastically changed how the game was played. That is, until 2018. Takara Tomy introduced the Super Z layer system, where each layer can now be metal. However, Hasbro decided to create their own entirely separate system for release at this time, called the Slingshot system. This gave the tops different modes where they could now climb rails. This presented a turning point where Hasbro would create its own Beyblades independent of Takara Tomy, but still based on the Burst series they created. And this is where we are today. In 2019, Takara Tomy created the GT layer system, and Hasbro created the Hypersphere system. While in 2020, Japan saw launchers that created sparks, Hasbro saw the Speedstorm system. 2021's Dynamite Battle Layer was met with Hasbro's Quad Drive system, and 2022's Ultimate Layer system, an upgrade to the previous year's system, corresponded with the Quad Strike system. While many fans seem to detest Hasbro's meddling with the Beyblade brand, who's to say where this will go? Maybe it will evolve into something entirely new, an American Beigoma, much like the capitalistic decisions back in Generation 1 created the much-loved system still in use today. Or maybe this split and decisions driven by profit motives rather than a desire to create a better toy will become an irreparable fissure in Beyblade's legacy and the end to the Burst series. So far, Burst is the longest running Beyblade series, and it shows no signs of slowing down, with the next system looming over the horizon. Hey, sorry, pausing. Future Caleb here. So, literally while I was finishing editing this video, they announced a 4th generation of Beyblade, and the trailer is so hyped, but just know, we're currently in a weird situation where I believe Hasbro has ordered an extra season of Beyblade Burst that isn't gonna air in Japan, or isn't a part of the Burst series in Japan, while Japan is going to be moving on to this new Beyblade Generation X coming in this summer. So I don't know what's going to come of that. Is Burst going to stay with Hasbro and we're just not going to get X? I really don't know. Just wanted to throw that out there. Embracing the history of Beigoma and developing based on how kids play, Takara saw success in reinventing the traditional Japanese top for the modern age. And having learned from their mistakes, Takara Tomy is going strong in the latest iteration of that invention. And it's all because some kids a few thousand years ago spun some shells and battled with them. They wouldn't accept the tops given to them and modified them for their own uses. And it was kids who wrote into Kazuki Takahashi, the mangaka for Yu-Gi-Oh!, to ask him to steer the manga more towards card games, fans practically inventing the inspiration for the first generation of Beyblades. It's a reminder that history is made by people. It's made by all of us, even the smallest people among us.